In our society, we often think of the workplace as a sanctuary of professionalism, a place of ambition and opportunity. It's where we spend a vast portion of our lives, building careers and friendships, striving for a better future. But what happens when that sanctuary becomes a prison? What happens when the person who holds the keys to your professional success is also the architect of your deepest fears? The story we are about to share is a difficult one. It shines a harsh light on the hidden corners of power, abuse, and the terrifying vulnerability that can exist even in the most ordinary of settings. It's a stark reminder that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they sit in the corner office. This is a story that needs to be heard, a voice that deserves to be remembered. If you believe in the importance of telling these stories, of giving a voice to the voiceless, I ask you to please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue our work. Now let us begin. Our story begins in the heart of a bustling city, within the gleaming glass and steel of a corporate tower. It begins with a young woman named Elena, who, like so many others, walked through those revolving doors every morning with dreams of her own. But she would soon discover that a dream can become a nightmare when you're trapped in the sights of a predator. The 32nd floor of the Sterlingthorne Corporation was designed to inspire awe. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a sprawling tapestry of concrete and ambition. The air was crisp with the scent of expensive air freshener and fresh coffee, and the only sounds were the soft hum of computers and the rhythmic, almost hypnotic clicking of keyboards. It was a world of polished surfaces and quiet professionalism, a place where success felt not just possible, but inevitable. For Elena Ramirez, this world was both a lifeline and a gilded cage. At 26, Elena possessed a quiet determination that often went unnoticed in the sea of louder, more aggressive personalities at Sterlingthorne. She was intelligent, diligent, and deeply committed to her work as a junior marketing analyst. She had landed the job 2 years prior, fresh out of a state college with a mountain of student debt and a burning desire to build a life for herself, a life far removed from the precarious, paycheck-to-paycheck existence of her childhood. She was the sole provider for her ailing mother, whose medical bills were a constant, looming shadow. This job wasn't just a career move for Elena. It was a necessity, the single pillar holding up the fragile structure of her world. She was good at her job. Her reports were meticulous, her insights sharp. She often stayed late, long after the sun had dipped below the city skyline, refining presentations and double-checking data. She believed, with the earnestness of the truly dedicated, that hard work was the only currency that mattered. She was, in every sense, the model employee, unassuming, reliable, and deeply grateful for the opportunity. It was this gratitude, this quiet desperation, that made her the perfect target. Her boss was Marcus Thorne. He was not just a department head. He was the son of the company's founder, a man who had inherited his position not through merit, but through birthright. Marcus was everything Elena was not. He was tall, impeccably dressed in bespoke suits, and moved with an easy, predatory grace. He possessed a charisma that was beau BC. At first, Elena was flattered. The praise was a balm to her insecurities, a validation of her hard work. She desperately wanted to succeed, to prove her worth, and the approval of Marcus Thorne felt like a golden ticket. She told herself that his extra attention was a sign that she was on the right track, that she was being groomed for a promotion. The subtle shifts began a few months into her second year. The compliments started to stray from the professional to the personal. "That color really suits you, Elena," he'd murmur as she passed his office. "You should wear it more often." A comment on her new hairstyle, a question about her weekend plans that felt a little too probing. He started asking her to stay late for one-on-one strategy sessions, meetings that would inevitably drift from market projections to questions about her personal life. "You're always so serious, Elena," he said one evening, leaning back in his plush leather chair, his office dark save for the glow of the city lights behind him. "You must have a boyfriend you're rushing home to." "No," Elena replied, her gaze fixed on the notepad in her lap. "I don't have time for that. I'm just focused on my work." A woman as beautiful as you? All work and no play. That's a shame, he said, his voice a low purr. We should change that. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She tried to steer the conversation back to the quarterly reports, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. But the comment hung in the air between them, an invisible line that had just been crossed. She began to dread these late-night sessions. The corner office, once a symbol of aspiration, now felt like a trap. The psychological abuse was a slow, creeping poison. Marcus was a master of manipulation, of mixing praise with a subtle undercurrent of threat. He would dangle the prospect of a promotion, a significant raise that would be life-changing for Elena and her mother, while simultaneously reminding her of her precarious position. You know, he'd say casually, the market's tight right now. We've had to let a few people go in the accounting department. But not you, Elena. I've told my father you're indispensable. You're my star player. The message was clear. I am protecting you. Your career, your livelihood is in my hands. Be grateful. The unspoken corollary was even more chilling. Do not displease me. He began to isolate her from her colleagues. He would assign her to special projects that required her to work alone, often directly with him. If he saw her chatting with a male colleague by the coffee machine, he would find a reason to interrupt, to pull her away for some urgent task. He created an invisible wall around her, making her his exclusive property within the office ecosystem. Her coworkers, seeing the special attention she was getting from the boss's son, began to keep their distance, their friendliness replaced by a mixture of envy and suspicion. They didn't see the fear in her eyes. They only saw the favor she was receiving. Elena felt utterly alone. Who could she possibly tell? The Human Resources Department was headed by a woman who was notoriously loyal to the Thorne family. Complaining about the founder's son seemed like professional suicide. She could quit, of course, but the thought was terrifying. It had taken her months to find this job. To leave without another one lined up would be financially catastrophic. Her mother's medical care, the rent on their small apartment, it all depended on the steady paycheck from Sterling Thorne. So she did what so many in her position do. She endured. She built a fortress within herself, becoming quieter, more withdrawn. She started dressing in bland, shapeless clothes, hoping to make herself invisible. She would take her lunch at her desk, avoiding the communal kitchen. She perfected the art of the non-committal smile and the vague, evasive answer. She tried to convince herself that it wasn't that bad, that he was just an over-friendly boss, that she was imagining the sinister undertones. But her body knew the truth. Her stomach was in a constant state of turmoil. She suffered from migraines. She would lie awake at night, replaying every conversation, every lingering look, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and humiliation. The situation escalated when Marcus's attentions turned physical. It started with small, seemingly accidental touches. A hand on the small of her back as he guided her through a doorway. His fingers brushing against hers as he took a report from her hand. Each touch was like an electric shock, a violation that sent a wave of nausea through her. She would flinch, pulling away, and he would give her a look of feigned innocence, as if to say, "What's wrong? I'm just being friendly." One evening, she was working late, finalizing a presentation for a major client. The office was deserted, the silence broken only by the sound of her typing. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear him approach. She only realized he was there when his hands came down on her shoulders. She jumped, a small cry escaping her lips. "Mr. Thorne, you scared me." "It's Marcus," he said, his voice close to her ear. His hands didn't move. They began to knead her shoulders, a grotesque parody of a massage. "You're so tense, Elena. You work too hard. You need to learn to relax." His touch was proprietary, possessive. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but she was frozen in her chair, paralyzed by fear. "The presentation is almost done," she managed to say, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. "Forget the presentation," he murmured, his breath warm on her neck. He leaned in closer, his cologne overwhelming her senses. "Let's talk about you and me. Please, Mr. Thorne," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't." He finally let go, but his tone shifted, the faux concern replaced by a chilling coldness. "You're a smart girl, Elena," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You know how things work. You do good work for me. I take care of you. It's a simple transaction. Don't make things complicated." He walked away without another word, leaving her trembling in the silent office. The mask had finally slipped. This wasn't about mentorship or friendship. It was about power, raw and ugly. He saw her not as an employee, but as a commodity, something he was entitled to. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. That night, Elena went home and for the first time, she began to actively search for another job. She updated her resume, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. She scrolled through job listings, a desperate hope flickering within her. But the process was slow, and every application she sent out felt like a lottery ticket. In the meantime, she had to keep going back to the office, back to the 32nd floor, back to the shadow in the corner office. She tried to create distance. She started communicating with Marcus primarily through email, avoiding face-to-face interaction whenever possible. She made excuses to leave the office exactly at 5 o'clock, claiming her mother needed her. But her avoidance only seemed to provoke him. He became more demanding, his emails more curt, his criticism of her work, which had once been flawless in his eyes, more pointed. He was punishing her for her defiance. The breaking point came on a Thursday. Marcus called her into his office at the end of the day. He closed the door, a soft click that echoed in the room like a gunshot. "We need to talk," he said, his smile gone, his eyes cold and hard. "I feel like you've been avoiding me, Elena. I don't like that." "I've just been very busy," she said, her eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet. "And my mother hasn't been well." He walked around his large mahogany desk and stood directly in front of her, forcing her to look at him. "I'm a very generous man," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've given you opportunities here that you would never have gotten otherwise. I've protected you, and I expect a certain level of appreciation in return." He reached out and stroked her cheek with the back of his hand. His touch was cold, reptilian. Elena recoiled as if she'd been burned. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, no." His expression hardened into a mask of rage. It was the first time she had seen the full extent of the monster lurking beneath the charming facade, and it was terrifying. "You're making a very big mistake," he hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You have no idea what I can do." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You will learn to be appreciative," he said, his face just inches from hers. "You will learn your place." He held her there for a long moment, the silence thick with his fury and her terror. Then, as abruptly as he had grabbed her, he let go, pushing her away. "Get out," he snarled, "and be in my office tomorrow morning at 7 sharp. We have a lot to discuss about your future at this company." Elena fled. She didn't stop at her desk, didn't grab her purse or her coat. She ran to the elevator, her breath coming in ragged sobs, and didn't stop running until she was out of the building and on the crowded street, lost in the anonymous sea of faces. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not go back. The threat was no longer just about her job. It was about her safety. He had shown her the monster, and she knew it would not be put back in its cage. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness of her small apartment, the city lights that had once seemed so full of promise now looking like the eyes of 1,000 indifferent witnesses. She had to escape. She just didn't know how. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, a cold, hard dread settled in her heart. She was supposed to be in his office. And she knew that if she didn't show up, he would come looking for her. The hunt had begun. The city awoke with its usual cacophony of sirens, traffic, and the distant roar of a new day beginning. For Elena, the sounds were a mocking reminder of a world that was moving on, oblivious to the paralyzing fear that had taken root in her soul. The thought of returning to the 32nd floor, of facing Marcus Thorne in his glass-walled office, was physically unbearable. The memory of his cold rage, the feel of his fingers digging into her arm, was a fresh trauma that played on a loop in her mind. She called in sick. Her voice, when she spoke to the automated attendance line, was a weak, trembling whisper that was almost unrecognizable as her own. It was a temporary solution, a flimsy shield against the inevitable, and she knew it. She spent the day in a state of agitated paralysis, alternating between frantic online job searches and staring blankly at the walls of her apartment. Every time her phone rang, her heart leaped into her throat, convinced it was him. She ignored the calls, watching the screen light up with the office's main number. Each missed call a small act of defiance that only amplified her terror. By late afternoon, an email arrived. The subject line was a single, ominous word: urgent. It was from Marcus. "Elena, I expected to see you this morning. My offer to discuss your future still stands. There are things we need to resolve. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Come to the office tomorrow. My private entrance in the garage will be open for you after hours. 7 p.m. Come alone." The message was a command, not a request. The mention of the private entrance, a little-used service door in the underground parking garage, was a clear signal. He wanted no witnesses. He was moving their conflict from the public space of the office to a secluded, private setting of his choosing. A cold dread, colder and deeper than any she had felt before, washed over her. This was no longer just about her job. This was a threat to her very being. She knew she couldn't go, but what was the alternative? Ignoring him would only escalate his rage. She felt trapped in an impossible checkmate. Her mind raced through a dozen desperate scenarios. Could she go to the police? What would she tell them? That her boss had grabbed her arm and said menacing things? It felt flimsy, her word against that of a powerful, respected man from a wealthy family. She imagined them looking at her with skepticism, seeing a disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble. Her thoughts turned to escape. She looked at her sleeping mother in the next room, her face peaceful in the dim light. How could she just disappear? She had responsibilities, a life that was inextricably tied to this city, to this apartment. Running required resources, money she didn't have. Every dollar she earned was already allocated to rent, utilities, and her mother's crushing medical expenses. Marcus Thorne hadn't just trapped her emotionally. He had trapped her financially. Her poverty was the bars of her cage. That evening, Elena made a decision. She would not go to the office, but she would not simply hide. She spent hours composing a letter. It was a resignation letter, but it was also something more. With painstaking detail, she documented everything. The lingering looks, the inappropriate comments, the late-night meetings, the unwanted touching, the final, chilling threat. She named dates and times, quoted his words as best she could remember them. She addressed the letter to the head of human resources and to Marcus's father, the CEO of Sterling Thorne. She would not be silent. If she was going to lose her job, she would make sure they knew exactly why. She planned to send it via a certified courier the next morning. She would then pack a small bag for herself and her mother and take a bus to her aunt's house in a town 3 hours away. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start. It was a plan. For the first time in months, a tiny, fragile sliver of control felt within her grasp. The next day, Saturday, was gray and overcast, the sky a bruised purple. Elena finalized her letter, her hands steady now, fueled by a new, desperate resolve. She was about to leave for the courier service when her apartment buzzer rang. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't expecting anyone. She walked to the intercom, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's Marcus." The voice was calm, almost casual, but to Elena, it was the sound of a nightmare made real. He had come to her home. He had crossed the final boundary. "Go away," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Elena, don't be childish. We need to talk." I have your final paycheck here, and a severance package. A very generous one. Just open the door. Let's handle this like adults. The mention of a generous severance was a calculated lure, an appeal to the very desperation that had kept her trapped for so long. She hesitated. The money would be a lifeline, the key to her escape plan. Maybe she could just take the check and he would leave. It was a foolish hope, and a part of her knew it, but the pull of a financial solution was overwhelmingly strong. With a shaking hand, she buzzed him in. It was a decision that would seal her fate. She stood by the door of her apartment, her hand on the deadbolt, her mind screaming at her not to open it. But then she heard his footsteps in the hall, calm and measured, and the moment of choice was gone. She opened the door, just a crack. He stood there, not in one of his expensive suits, but in casual clothes, a dark jacket and jeans. He looked like any other man, but his eyes held the same cold intensity she had seen in his office. He held up a large manila envelope. "See," he said, offering a placid smile. "Just business." She reached for the envelope, but he pulled it back slightly. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" he asked, his voice still soft. "It's not very polite to leave me standing in the hallway." Before she could answer, he pushed the door open, forcing his way inside. He was much stronger than he looked. He closed the door behind him, and the click of the latch was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. The small apartment, her only sanctuary, was instantly suffocating, filled with his menacing presence. "Where's the letter, Elena?" he asked, the smile vanishing, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "What letter?" she stammered, backing away. "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled, advancing on her. "I know you've been writing things. I know what you're planning. Did you really think you could defy me? Did you really think you could walk away and try to ruin me?" He saw the letter on her small dining table, addressed and sealed. He lunged for it, tearing it open. His eyes scanned the pages, his face contorting into a mask of pure fury. "You stupid little fool," he hissed, crumpling the pages in his fist. "You thought this would save you? This is a death warrant." Elena's survival instinct finally kicked in. She turned and ran for the door, but he was too fast. He caught her, his hand clamping over her mouth, stifling her scream. He was terrifyingly strong, his body an unyielding wall of muscle. He dragged her away from the door, back into the living room, his other arm wrapped around her waist like a band of steel. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was useless. He was a predator and she was his prey. Her vision began to swim, black spots dancing in front of her eyes from the lack of air. His hand was a suffocating weight, pressing the life out of her. "You should have just been appreciative," he whispered in her ear, his voice a venomous caress. "You should have known your place. I gave you everything, and you threw it back in my face. No one says no to me. No one." In that small, silent apartment, with the sounds of the city carrying on unheedingly outside, Marcus Thorne's rage reached its terrible crescendo. There was no mercy in his eyes, only a cold, possessive fury. He was not just destroying a life. He was erasing a problem, silencing a voice that dared to speak against him. He was ensuring that the sound of her defiance would never be heard. The struggle was brief, and then there was only silence. A deep, profound, and terrible silence. Marcus stood over her, his breathing heavy, his designer clothes disheveled. He looked down at what he had done, not with remorse, but with a cold, clinical detachment. The problem was solved. Now he had to manage the cleanup. He was meticulous, methodical. His mind, which was usually occupied with market strategies and corporate takeovers, now focused on the grim logistics of concealment. He found a roll of trash bags under the kitchen sink. He retrieved a large, heavy-duty tarp from the trunk of his car, which he had parked in a visitor spot in the building's garage. He worked quickly, efficiently, his movements precise. He wiped down every surface he had touched: the doorknob, the table, the intercom button. He took the crumpled letter, her final, unheard testament, and placed it in his pocket. He took her purse, her keys, and her cell phone. He needed to create the illusion that she had simply left. The most difficult part was removing her from the apartment. He waited until the deep cover of night, until the building had settled into its late-night quiet. He wrapped her in the tarp, a gruesome, anonymous bundle, and carried her down the back service stairs to the garage. He placed her in the trunk of his expensive sedan, a space usually reserved for golf clubs and weekend bags. He drove out of the city, heading north, towards the vast, undeveloped tracts of state forest land. He drove for hours, the city lights receding in his rearview mirror, replaced by an impenetrable darkness. He found a remote, little-used access road, the kind of place people only go to dump old furniture or unwanted trash. He dragged his terrible burden deep into the woods, into a thicket of undergrowth where she would not be easily found. He left her there, in the cold, damp earth, under a canopy of indifferent trees. He drove back to the city as the sun was rising, a new day dawning on his terrible secret. He stopped at a car wash, meticulously cleaning the interior and trunk of his car. He drove to a bridge on the far side of town and threw her purse, her keys, and her phone into the fast-moving river below. He went home to his sterile, minimalist penthouse apartment, showered, and put on one of his immaculate suits. On Monday morning, Marcus Thorne walked into his office on the 32nd floor. He was calm, composed, his charismatic smile firmly in place. When his secretary asked if he had heard from Elena Ramirez, he feigned a look of mild concern. "No, I haven't," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "She was supposed to have a report on my desk this morning. It's not like her to be so unreliable. If you hear from her, let me know." He had created a perfect void. Elena Ramirez was simply gone. Her colleagues assumed she had quit without notice, a theory that Marcus himself subtly encouraged. "I guess the pressure was too much for her," he'd say with a sigh. "It's a shame. She had potential." No one questioned him. He was Marcus Thorne. His world was one of power and privilege, a world where inconvenient problems and inconvenient people simply disappeared. And in the silence that followed, he was confident that his secret was safe, buried deep in the woods, far from the gleaming towers of the city. For the first few weeks, it seemed as though Marcus Thorne's chilling confidence was justified. Elena Ramirez had vanished, and the world barely registered her absence. As Sterling Thorne, she was quickly replaced. A new junior analyst now sat at her desk, and the memory of the quiet, hard-working young woman began to fade into the background of the busy corporate hum. There was no formal inquiry into her departure. She was simply another employee who had, for whatever reason, moved on. The narrative that Marcus had carefully crafted, that she was an unstable employee who had buckled under pressure, was quietly accepted. The first person to truly feel the weight of her absence was her aunt, Maria. After not hearing from Elena for several days, and with her calls going straight to voicemail, a knot of worry began to tighten in her chest. It was completely out of character for Elena, who was meticulously responsible, to not check in, especially concerning her mother's health. Maria drove the 3 hours to the city, her anxiety growing with every mile. She found her sister, Elena's mother, confused and distressed. Elena hadn't been home in days. Maria called the police and filed a missing person report. The initial response was procedural and frustratingly slow. The officer who took the report was professional but detached. An adult woman had a right to disappear, he explained. There were no signs of foul play at the apartment. It looked as though she had simply packed a bag and left. He took down the information, promised to make some inquiries, and the case of Elena Ramirez became just another file in a stack of countless others. But Maria was persistent. She knew in her gut that something was terribly wrong. She called Elena's office and was stonewalled by the HR department, who cited privacy policies and refused to give her any information beyond confirming that Elena was no longer an employee. The wall of corporate silence was impenetrable. The case landed on the desk of Detective Frank Miller. Miller was a 30-year veteran of the force, a rumpled, weary-looking man with eyes that had seen the worst of human nature. He was nearing retirement and had a reputation for being dogged and methodical, a man who didn't like loose ends. At first glance, Elena's file looked unremarkable. But as he read Maria's statement, something pricked at his investigator's intuition. The story of the dedicated daughter and sole provider who suddenly abandons her sick mother didn't add up. People like Elena Ramirez didn't just walk away. Miller started by doing what the initial officers had not. He went to Sterling Thorne himself. He wasn't interested in speaking to HR. He wanted to talk to the people who had worked with Elena every day. He was met with the same corporate polish and deflections he expected, but Miller was an expert at reading the subtle cues of fear and evasion. He interviewed a half-dozen of Elena's former colleagues. Most gave him the company line. Elena was quiet, kept to herself, and had seemed stressed lately. But one young woman, a fellow analyst named Sarah who had been friendly with Elena in her early days at the company, showed a flicker of something more. When Miller asked about Elena's relationship with her boss, Marcus Thorne, Sarah's eyes darted nervously towards the corner office. He seemed to like her work, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her a lot of special projects. Special projects? Miller prodded gently. Did that seem unusual? A little, Sarah admitted, twisting a paperclip in her hands. She was always staying late, always meeting with him, alone. It was a small crack in the facade, but it was enough for Miller. He decided to take a closer look at Marcus Thorne. A background check revealed nothing criminal, just the gilded life of a privileged son. But Miller knew that the most pristine surfaces could hide the darkest secrets. The first significant break came from an unexpected source. A sanitation worker, emptying a public garbage can several blocks from Elena's apartment building, found a discarded, crumpled piece of paper. It was torn and stained, but the words were still legible. It was the letter Elena had written, the one Marcus thought he had disposed of. He had callously tossed it away during his cleanup, a moment of arrogant carelessness. The worker, seeing the distressing nature of the letter's content, turned it over to the police. When the letter reached Miller's desk, it was like a voice from the grave. It was a detailed, chilling account of Marcus Thorne's escalating harassment and abuse. It laid out the entire narrative of fear and intimidation. It ended with a description of the final threat and his demand that she meet him at the office. Suddenly, Elena's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was the potential final act of a terrifying story. With the letter as a catalyst, the investigation kicked into high gear. Miller obtained a warrant for Marcus Thorne's phone records and the security footage from Elena's apartment building and the Sterling Thorne offices. The digital breadcrumbs began to paint a damning picture. The phone records showed a flurry of calls from Marcus to Elena on the day she disappeared, all of them ignored. They also showed his phone pinging off a cell tower near her apartment building that evening. The security footage from her building was even more conclusive. It showed Marcus Thorne arriving, talking his way in through the intercom, and entering the building. Hours later, in the dead of night, the footage from the parking garage showed him carrying a large, heavy, tarp-wrapped object and placing it in the trunk of his car. The security footage from the Sterling Thorne building for that same night showed that Marcus had never gone to the office. His story about wanting to meet her there was a lie, a lure. Miller now had enough to bring Marcus in for questioning. He sat across from the handsome, confident executive in a stark interrogation room, a stark contrast to Marcus's luxurious office. Marcus was the picture of calm indignation. He had his high-priced lawyer with him, and he denied everything. "This is absurd," Marcus said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Elena was an unstable employee. She made advances towards me, and when I rejected her, she became vindictive. This letter of hers is pure fantasy, the work of a woman scorned." But Miller didn't flinch. He laid out the evidence piece by piece. The phone records, the security footage from the apartment, the lie about the office meeting. "We have you entering her building, Mr. Thorne," Miller said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "And we have you leaving in the middle of the night with a large object that you put in the trunk of your car. Would you like to tell us what was in that tarp?" For the first time, a flicker of fear appeared in Marcus's eyes. His lawyer immediately stopped the questioning. But the damage was done. The invincible facade of Marcus Thorne was beginning to crack. Based on the evidence, Miller's team obtained a warrant to search Marcus's car and his penthouse apartment. The forensics team went over the car with painstaking care. In the trunk, tucked deep into the carpet fibers, they found what they were looking for: a single strand of long, dark hair. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Elena Ramirez. They also found microscopic traces of soil. The soil was sent to a forensic geologist, who analyzed its specific mineral and pollen composition. The unique combination of elements pointed to a specific region in the state forests north of the city. It was a huge search area, but it narrowed the focus immensely. Miller organized a massive search operation, involving dozens of officers and canine units. For days, they combed the dense woods. Finally, one of the dogs got a scent, leading the search team to a thicket of dense undergrowth. And there, beneath a shallow covering of leaves and dirt, they found her. The discovery of Elena's body transformed the case into a high-profile homicide. The media, which had previously ignored the story of a missing woman, now descended in a frenzy. The tale of the wealthy, powerful executive and his murdered junior employee was a story of shocking brutality and class disparity. With the discovery of the body and the overwhelming evidence against him, Marcus Thorne was arrested and charged with murder. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution, led by a sharp and tenacious district attorney, systematically dismantled Marcus's defense. They presented the letter, the security footage, the phone records, the DNA evidence, and the soil analysis. They also brought Elena's co-worker, Sarah, to the stand. Bolstered by the mountain of evidence and freed from her fear, she told the court about the atmosphere of intimidation, about the special attention Marcus paid to Elena, and about the visible fear she had seen in her friend's eyes in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Marcus Thorne's defense team tried to paint Elena as a disgruntled seductress, and him as the victim of a malicious lie. But the jury saw through the desperate character assassination. They saw the evidence for what it was: the irrefutable story of a predator who had abused, terrorized, and ultimately murdered a vulnerable woman to protect his power and silence her voice. After a long and grueling trial, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty, on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the sentence: life in prison with no possibility of parole. Marcus Thorne, the man who had moved through the world with an unshakable sense of entitlement, finally had his freedom taken from him. He showed no emotion as he was led away, his handsome face a mask of cold stone. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served. But for Detective Miller, and for Elena's family, it was a hollow victory. Predator was off the streets, but it wouldn't bring Elena back. Her voice, which she had tried so hard to use, had only truly been heard in death. Her story, however, did not end with the verdict. It sent shockwaves through the corporate world of the city. Sterling Thorne was hit with a massive wrongful death lawsuit. An internal investigation revealed a toxic culture of fear and a history of HR complaints against Marcus Thorne that had been systematically buried. His father, the CEO, was forced to resign in disgrace. The case of Elena Ramirez became a catalyst for change, a tragic but powerful example of the devastating consequences of unchecked power and workplace abuse. Her story, born in silence and fear, became a rallying cry, empowering others to speak out. The unraveling of Marcus Thorne was not just the downfall of one man. It was the tearing down of a wall of silence, leaving a legacy that was far more powerful than any corporate title.